couple of years ago, I got my first job. I only worked there for about 5 months. They paid me minimum wage, but I needed the money, and they were the first to get back to me out of all the places I applied. I didn't love the job, but it helped cover the bills for my girlfriend and me at the time. I didn't have a car, so I walked to work every day. The job was only a 5-minute walk from my apartment, so it wasn't too bad. My schedule was all over the place, and I worked whenever they needed me. Mostly, I did second shift. To save time, I took a shortcut to work, a trail that led through a small field behind the gas station where I worked. One day, as I was walking to work, I noticed a guy I'd never seen before sitting in the woods by the trail. He was lying on his side, and the whole area smelled like weed. I think I startled him when I walked past. "Whoa, kid, you scared the heck out of me," he said. "Want a hit? I'm bored and could use someone to talk to." I politely said no and told him I had to get to work, but he kept asking. "Come on, just take a couple hits, it'll make your day better." I don't give in to peer pressure, so I told him firmly, "No, thanks, I really have to go." Then I kept walking. "Wait, I'm sorry," he called after me. "I didn't mean to offend you, I was just trying to be friendly." I told him it was fine, but I couldn't stay and chat. I needed to get to work. I don't have anything against weed, but it's not my thing. Plus, going to work high would have spiked my anxiety. He then asked me for $5, saying he was homeless and hadn't eaten in 3 days. My first instinct was to say no, but I gave him $5 to get him off my back. He thanked me, and I continued walking to work, thinking, that guy was a little weird. I thought about it for a bit while at work, but soon forgot about it as the day went on. By the end of my shift, everything was normal, and I wasn't even thinking about the strange man anymore. At around 11:45 p.m., as I waited for Josh, the third shift guy, to come in and take over, I noticed someone standing outside, staring at me through the window. At first, I thought they were just smoking, but then I realized they hadn't moved. It was a man, but I couldn't see his face clearly. Every time I looked over at him, he was still standing there, staring. He hadn't moved at all. It made me feel uneasy, but I tried to ignore it, picked up a broom, and kept cleaning up my area. Josh was supposed to be there 15 minutes ago, and he'd never been late before. I thought maybe he'd called off. A few minutes later, my manager called to tell me Josh had indeed called off, and I'd have to cover the shift. I was annoyed but agreed. I also told him about the guy staring at me outside. "He's still there," I said. "He's just staring at me and hasn't moved." My manager told me to tell the guy to leave or he'd call the police, so I walked outside and said, "Hey man, it's time for you to go." The guy just stood there staring at me for another 10 to 15 seconds, not saying a word. I told him, "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave." Then I went back inside to grab my phone. When I came back, he was gone. I looked around, but there was no trace of him. I didn't see a car, and there was no way he could have driven off. I checked the back of the gas station, and there he was, standing in the middle of the field I took as a shortcut to work every day. He was just a black shadow in the distance, maybe 75 feet away, holding something in his hand. He was staring at me again. We stood there in silence for about 20 seconds, and then he started running towards me. Luckily, I was closer to the gas station than he was, so I booked it inside and locked the door. I looked back, and he was now standing under a streetlight, still staring. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. There was no sign of him, even though I showed them the camera footage and gave them the best description I could. I think it was the same guy I had given $5 to earlier, but I'm not sure. He had long gray hair, but the guy I talked to before had a beanie on, so maybe I just didn't notice. Either way, I stopped taking the shortcut after that, just in case. The police never found him, and I haven't heard anything since. It makes me uncomfortable to think he might still be out there, doing the same thing to other people. I manage a Speedway gas station in Cleveland, Ohio. It's in a tough neighborhood, but the pay is decent and I can't afford to switch jobs right now, even if I wanted to. One night, around 10 o'clock, I was working the register. My only other co-worker that night was in the back, stocking drinks and handling inventory. It gets pretty busy, and when you're the only one up front, it's hard to keep track of everything. I noticed this sketchy guy walking around the store for about 10 minutes, which was unusual. Most people are in and out quickly, but he kept making eye contact with me. It made me nervous, especially given how dangerous the area is. We're told not to intervene if we catch someone stealing, just report it to a higher up, but I had a bad feeling about this guy as soon as he got in line. When it was his turn, he asked for a pack of Newports and had a tall Bud Light. He reeked of alcohol and was slurring his words. I told him I couldn't sell him the beer, and that's when he lost it. He grabbed the cigarettes and the beer and bolted for the door. But he didn't get far. He tripped almost immediately, and 2 more beers he was trying to steal fell out of his pant leg. An older man who had seen the whole thing tackled him before he could get up, wrestling the items away from him. They struggled for a bit, and just when it seemed like the situation was calming down, the guy pulled a pocket knife and swung at the older man, cutting his arm. Thankfully, another customer stepped in and punched the guy right in the nose. He knocked over some candy, then ran out of the store. I called the police, and we rushed the older man to the hospital. Of course, the thief was long gone before the police even showed up, which took them over 30 minutes. They couldn't do much except take a report and try to figure out who he was. What really gets me is that the guy still comes into the store sometimes, acting all passive-aggressive. He's even apologized to me once, but on another occasion, he threatened to fight me. The stress of working here is wearing me down, not just because of him, but everything else too. I need the money though. I'm a single dad, barely scraping by at the end of the month. I'm 30 years old, haven't graduated high school yet, but I plan on getting my GED soon. After that, I want to go to trade school to become an electrician, so I can make a better living for my daughter and myself. I've had a rough past, but I'm trying to turn my life around. This happened around 4 years back. My friend Evan and I were heading to the store for some late-night snacks. I realized I needed gas, so we stopped at a gas station. We had planned to go to Walmart, but since we were already at the gas station, we figured we'd just grab our snacks there to save time. I paid at the pump and started filling up the car while Evan went inside. I told him I'd meet him in a few minutes. When I walked into the store, it was strangely quiet. Too quiet. There was no sign of Evan, the worker, or anyone else. I thought maybe Evan was in the bathroom, so I didn't worry too much. I started browsing for snacks and drinks while I waited, but time passed, and I still hadn't seen Evan. I knocked on the bathroom door. No response. That's when things started to feel off. I tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. Then I heard a scream coming from the back of the store. My heart started racing. Something wasn't right. I knew I shouldn't go into the back, but I didn't care. I was too worried about Evan. As I got closer, I heard his voice. I ran towards him and saw something I'll never forget. There was a man on the floor, the gas station employee, and he was barely recognizable. He had been beaten so badly that I couldn't even tell what he looked like. It was the most gruesome thing I've ever seen. Evan was on the phone with the police, trying to stay calm, while the employee, his name was Parker, I think, was lying there, bleeding out and slipping in and out of consciousness. I started crying. Parker had broken ribs, a broken nose, and a concussion. Blood was pouring from a wound on his head, and his face was covered in it. It felt like he wasn't going to make it. But thankfully, the cops and ambulance arrived quickly, and he was rushed to the hospital. Later, we found out what happened. The guy who did this to Parker was his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend. Apparently, they had some kind of fight, and this was the result. I can't imagine what kind of hatred would make someone do something so brutal. Evan told me he witnessed part of the attack and tried to stop the guy before he ran off. Evan also mentioned that the attacker matched the description of someone I had seen running out of the store while I was pumping gas. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed the guy was in a hurry, but now I realize he was probably waiting for the perfect moment to strike, or maybe just caught Parker at the wrong time. The police found the attacker later that night at his apartment. He was drunk and tried to run, but they caught him. As for Parker, he still works at the gas station, and I see him whenever I stop by. I can't even imagine what going through something like that would do to someone's mind. Back in 2017, I was working at a gas station. It was a cold, frosty night when I started my overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I wasn't happy with the job, but finding something better wasn't easy. The night shifts fit my schedule, but staying awake was always tough. I parked next to my coworker's car, went inside, and took over for him. My manager left a list of tasks for me, which wouldn't take more than an hour to finish. I wasn't in a hurry, though. I wanted to keep busy so I wouldn't get sleepy. Around midnight, things got weird. An old SUV pulled up to the pump. It was snowing lightly, and most people avoided the roads, but it wasn't too strange for someone to stop by. I got distracted watching videos on my phone and lost track of time. After a while, I looked outside and noticed the SUV was still there, but now the headlights were off, and no one was getting out. It seemed odd. I put on my jacket and went outside to check. As I got closer to the car, I saw it was empty. I called out, but no one answered. That's when I noticed footprints in the snow leading around the side of the building. It was freezing, and I didn't feel like wandering out there in the cold, so I went back inside and turned on the small heater behind the counter to warm up. A few minutes later, I heard a loud thud behind me. I turned around and saw muddy boot prints and puddles on the floor. My heart started racing. Standing there in the shadows was a tall guy with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard. I froze, not sure what to do. He didn't say anything, and I just backed up to the counter. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to keep my voice low so he wouldn't hear me. It felt like forever, but finally, 2 officers arrived. I told them what happened, and they searched the back of the store where the man had been, but when they came back, they said he was gone. There were watery footprints by the back door, and new tracks in the snow leading into a field behind the gas station. The SUV turned out to be abandoned, and no one could figure out who owned it. The police looked around, but there were no clues about where the guy went or what he wanted. To this day, I still wonder who that man was and what his intentions were. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy, and I never looked at night shifts the same way again. I was thrilled when I got promoted to manager of the customer service department. I'd been with the company, which sells pellet and wood stoves, for 8 years, and finally, I felt like I had a stable position. I really liked my team too. There were only 6 of us in the office, including me, and for the most part, everyone did their job. The hardest part of being a manager came when I had to fire someone. There was one guy who was always coming in late and slacking off when he was there. Eventually, the higher-ups told me to give him a formal warning. After he ignored it, I was told I had no choice but to let him go. I called him into my office to explain the situation. As soon as he realized he was being fired, he got really angry, raising his voice and saying it wasn't fair. I tried to explain it was out of my hands and that we had to part ways. To my surprise, he eventually calmed down. He was still upset, but after I handed him his termination slip, he just walked out. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about firing him. It didn't feel good, but I figured it was over, and I wouldn't have to deal with that kind of thing again for a while. I was wrong. The next day, everything went smoothly. Since it was Friday, I decided to let everyone leave an hour early, and I'd close up on my own. I had no idea the guy I fired was sitting in the parking lot, waiting. After everyone had left, I sat behind my desk. A few minutes later, I heard the office door open. I assumed someone had forgotten something, but when I looked up, I was shocked to see the former employee storming into my office with a gun pointed at me. I froze. His face was red, and I could smell beer on his breath. Before I could say anything, he looked around to make sure no one else was there. In a panic, I thought I might be able to slip past him, but that was a terrible idea. He saw me trying to move, and he pushed the gun closer to my face, ordering me to stay put. The next few minutes felt like hours. He started ranting about how I'd ruined his life. I apologized, telling him I had no choice, but he just kept yelling, "You don't know, sorry." I was terrified he was going to pull the trigger. Thankfully, one of the building's security guards had seen the guy enter and noticed he was armed. He didn't try to stop him, probably for the best, but called the police instead. The guy was so focused on me that he didn't even notice the two officers quietly enter the office. By the time he realized they were there, it was too late. I dropped to the floor, hiding behind my desk as the police arrested him. Luckily, no shots were fired, and he was charged with multiple offenses. Even though the situation ended without anyone getting hurt, it's something I'll never forget.